Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Prime Minister has announced a full independent public inquiry into the government's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. Boris Johnson said it would start next spring and would put the state's actions under the microscope. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, welcomed the inquiry but said it should begin as soon as possible. Our Deputy Political Editor Vicky Young reports.
After more than a year of COVID trauma, what are the lessons the country must learn?
The UK now has one of the highest COVID death rates in the world.
Why weren't we better prepared for a pandemic? Were the right decisions made at the right time?
You must stay at home.
To protect the most vulnerable. And why did some things go better than others?
When you get the call, get the jab.
Will lessons be learned?
Today we're a step closer to getting some answers.
Amid such tragedy, the state has an obligation to examine its actions as rigorously and as candidly as possible and to learn every lesson for the future, which is why I've always said that when the time is right, there should be a full and independent inquiry.
The inquiry is due to start next spring and evidence will be given under oath. Fran had been married just 3 weeks when her husband Steve died of COVID last year. She told me she was pleasantly surprised when she heard today's announcement, but questioned the timing.
What we would like to have is a rapid review, and that's something that could be done in a matter of weeks, that wouldn't tie up people's time to the degree that a full judge-led inquiry would involve. And that would hopefully begin to get some quick answers to some of the very pressing questions that need to be resolved so that other families don't have the same experience as we've had.
But the government says doing it now would distract those still dealing with the pandemic. When it comes to the scope of the inquiry, the Labour leader had this request.
This inquiry will only work if it has the support and confidence of the families. And I urge the Prime Minister and the government to consult the families at the earliest possible moment. The government should also consult those on the front line who have done so much, whether in the NHS, social care or other front lines.
The families of those who've died want answers, and the Prime Minister has promised transparency. Ministers and officials will be quizzed in public. Thousands of documents will be published. But inquiries like this are never quick. It could be years, probably after the next election, before conclusions are reached. The hope is that looking back and learning lessons will mean no more names are added to this wall. But today, an international panel highlighted serious failures across the globe and said without urgent change, the world will be at the mercy of another disease outbreak. Vicky Young, BBC News, Westminster.
Now, Boris Johnson has confirmed that there will be an independent public inquiry into the handling of the COVID pandemic. He told MPs that the country was owed as much transparency as possible. But it will be some time before that happens. The scope of the inquiry has yet to be agreed, and it will not begin its work until spring next year. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, reports from Westminster.
Across the river from Parliament, 150,000 red hearts to commemorate the lives lost in the pandemic. Boris Johnson announced the government's actions throughout the pandemic would be put under the microscope of a public inquiry. But it mustn't start, he said, until next spring.
The time that people will have to spend testifying in public, in some cases for days, will place a significant burden on our NHS, on the whole of government, on our scientific advisers and on many others. We must not inadvertently divert or distract the very people on whom we all depend in the heat of our struggle against this disease.
Boris Johnson said there was a high likelihood of a surge of COVID infections in the coming winter, and the inquiry mustn't distract from that. The Prime Minister knows he'll be amongst those who'll be giving evidence in public session, cross-examined about questions like whether he locked down too late last autumn and whether last March he was too slow to realise he had to lock down at all.
One of the theories is that, perhaps you could sort of take it on the chin, take it all in one go and allow the disease, as it were, to move through the population.
The time has now come for us all to do more.
Many think the Prime Minister's rushed forward what doesn't look like a properly cooked announcement. because he wants to take the sting out of what he thinks his former aide and now sworn enemy Dominic Cummings might say when he gives evidence on COVID to MPs in a fortnight's time. When Dominic Cummings last spoke in public, he sounded quite keen to spill some beans.
I'll be very happy to come back and answer any and all questions about how Number 10 works, why I left.
The Labour leader worried how long the inquiry would take and wanted it started sooner so it could report much earlier.
The principle is that the inquiry should be as soon as possible. As soon as possible. Now, I understand an inquiry, a statutory inquiry, will take time to set up. Of course it will. But why can it not be later this year? Why can it not start earlier?
We owe it to the country to produce answers within a reasonable timescale.
The Bloody Sunday inquiry took 12 years to finish. The Iraq inquiry, 7 years. The child abuse inquiry was started over 6 years ago and isn't finished. The phone hacking inquiry managed a quicker format, helped by dropping half its original brief. The average of public inquiries is 2.5 years, but in recent decades, 13 have gone on for 5 or more years. If Boris Johnson went for an early general election in 2023, or even waited until 2024, this could easily be an inquiry which hasn't finished when he is trying to get re-elected.
It's lining up to be a very long, judge-led inquiry with sort of rather formal evidence taking. And I'm afraid if that's the case, then it's going to take a long time. I find this very hard to see how you're going to contain it in a couple of years.
The Prime Minister said the government would use the time between now and next spring to consult widely, including victims groups and devolved administrations, before the ground rules for the inquiry were set.
Well, as the UK COVID inquiry moves closer, the World Health Organization today published a report that is highly critical of governments across the world, and indeed itself, for the handling of the early stages of the pandemic. Our Health and Social Care Editor Victoria MacDonald joins me now. Victoria.
Yes, this is an independent report commissioned by the World Health Organization, and quite frankly, it pulls no punches. Millions of lives could have been saved. That's the headline. There was lost time, they say, in reporting the cluster of pneumonia cases in Wuhan in December 2019. Lost time in declaring a public health emergency. They said that lost month could have contained the spread of the virus. Rapid and consistent actions from the outset could have made our world look very different today, the report says. National leaders who devalued science and denied COVID's severity were in stark contrast to leaders who, through a consistent whole-of-government approach, kept citizens safe and contained the virus. They were critical of the US and European countries who waited till their ICUs were filling up. They were also critical of the WHO itself, which meant that they had to ask China's permission before declaring a potential pandemic. And they said the WHO should be allowed to send in investigators when there is a threat of a potential pandemic. Now, that is a direct reference to the fact-finding mission that the WHO did eventually get into China, but which many concluded was too little, too late.
Thanks, Victoria. Well, with me now is Charlie Williams, one of the founding members of COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice UK. His father, Rex, died of coronavirus at a care home in April last year. We're also joined by Professor of Global Public Health at Edinburgh University and Scottish Government Advisor, Devi Sridhar. Mr. Williams, first of all, thanks for joining us. What's your initial reaction to today's announcement?
Oh, thanks for having me. Yes, we basically welcome, at last, Boris has finally given us a date. However, as you know, we've been campaigning for over a year now, and kick this down the road further again next year is just absolutely not acceptable to our 4,000 bereaved family members, as well as the rest of the country. It's not acceptable at all.
What about the balance between how much blame you want identified for who got what wrong versus the lessons that we should learn for the future? What do you think is the main point of having an inquiry like this?
Well, first of all, we're not interested in blame. We're interested in saving lives. Importantly, this is the whole point of having the inquiry for us, is to save lives and, importantly, to learn lessons. Kicking this down the road further again, we're going to have a loss of lives. Potentially, we could be looking at a third wave, and once again, we want to go into another winter where more lives could be at risk again. I think our bereaved families and our country deserve better from Boris, and we need this inquiry this summer, not next year.
Okay, Devi Sridhar, what do you think is the point of an inquiry that is likely to take years? I mean, is it going to help?
Well, I think there's two things. One is to learn the lessons, and there are clear mistakes that were made that we need to look at, including, starting with the herd immunity strategy and treating this like flu instead of actually going for, suppression and elimination. And secondly, for accountability. I mean, if you hit someone with your car, you are liable for that. If you create bad policies that kill thousands of people due to kind of negligence, we need to address that. So I think there's actually two purposes to an inquiry.
But I mean, the lesson from most public inquiries into big controversies is that those people who really seek accountability don't feel that they've got it, because these things very rarely identify, and sort of nail something, in terms of who got the thing wrong and who's really to blame. So in terms of what would be useful from an inquiry, what are the things it needs to look at?
Well, I think we need to look at, several of the missteps. So first was around strategy, treating this like flu, which we know put us back. I mean, it's where Sweden has also gone off and its Scandinavian neighbors. Second, around testing. Why were we not actually trying to build that faster? Our isolation policies, borders. We know the borders were left open for quite a long time with no testing or sequencing or anything of passengers coming in. The lockdown easing, the messaging. I think there's a lot to be learned, as we learned from the WHO report today, and that can help us moving forward to make sure we do a better job, because the next pandemic will come and we want to make sure we avoid lockdowns and we avoid people dying.
But could you write it now? I mean, does it need to be a long, drawn-out process? You've just identified the things that were the mistakes, as many people have over the last year. Don't we know what went wrong?
I think we very clearly know what went wrong. And I think the problem is probably people are more concerned about their legacy and covering up for their kind of reputation than actually looking at, being honest about things we got wrong. I mean, I've been straightforward on things that I think scientists have gotten wrong at the start. Luckily, vaccines and science have saved us in the end. But I think we do have enough information to move hope forward right now. I don't think we need to learn anything more in the next year or two. Kind of the writing's on the wall.
Charlie Williams, can I also ask you about the memorial? I mean, we saw earlier when Victoria was reporting from, well, if you like, the People's Memorial. How do you feel about a memorial, and what do you want?
Of course, a memorial is very important. You're obviously aware of the wall that we organised in London. Memorials are very, very important. And, the COVID-19 is something this country is never, ever going to forget. We've got to be responsible, and our Prime Minister has to act in a responsible way, get this inquiry done this year. We cannot wait till next year. We don't want to risk one more life, never mind the 127,000. We really need to get this done now and stop risking lives.
And finally, Devi Sridhar, I mean, are we better prepared now for the next pandemic? Because there will be one.
Oh, I think definitely. I think part of the problem was the complacency that we saw from leaders, that we would never see this kind of outbreak in a high-income country. I mean, West Africa knew how horrific this could be. South Korea knew how horrific this could be. But somehow Europe and Britain and the States were really passive, and I think we won't see that anymore. I think we will see forward-looking, preemptive action. Britain has gotten its act together. We're now doing really well, but it took a year or so for us to get there.
Professor Devi Sridhar, Charlie Williams, thank you both very much.